Hello and welcome to the Connections webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Communication program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on leveraging strategic communication and corporate diplomacy for success. My name is Natalie Cross, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Connections playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Assistant Program Director for the Master of Arts in Communication program.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and a special thank you to Anna Clark, who is our guest speaker today. She is a communication leader for TERREPOWER, also the president and founder of EarthPeople Media, and a proud alum of JHU. But I will let her talk about herself. So again, thank you for joining, and I look forward to hearing your questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Is this good? Can everyone hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Excellent. And thank you, Natalie, for running the presentation. This is really exciting for me to get to be here speaking to JHU students, alums, others. You know, this program has just made an extraordinary difference in my career path. Some of that, I believe, will come through in this presentation. For the most part, the presentation is not about me. It's about everyone, all of us, struggling to adapt in this crazy, rapidly changing world. What I've learned since coming out of the JHU program is that communication is one of the most essential skill sets that is out there in business, but also one of the most misunderstood and perhaps undervalued skill sets. What's been very exciting to learn as I've navigated a global career across domains and across industries and disciplines is that awareness is now growing rapidly around the need for strategic communication, and communications roles are proliferating. So I find that very, very hopeful. My hope is that this presentation will give you insight into ways to use your communication degree, skills, interests in novel ways that address global problems, because that is the skill set that's going to keep you on a career path where you're in constant and growing demand. So with all that said, I'm going to be tag teaming with Natalie, who is going to help me advance the slides while I'm able to access some of my notes. And so I think we can move off of this slide to our table of contents. These are the things we'll cover, and we're casting this as about success because I think the reality is that we want success for our clients, we want success in our careers, but success also looks like personal success and fulfillment in our roles. And a lot of that comes down to the way that you look at your job. And so I'm going to teach a little bit about how we can take our role and make it so much more important and critical than maybe you ever thought it could be. And the same would apply to how we look at the role of the organizations we represent. Communication for transformation is really the name of this game. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in the context of the things happening in the world today. And then we'll take a look at how to look through the impact lens, which is how I do my work every day and how I think many, many professionals can benefit by approaching their work. And then finally, integrating strategies for corporate diplomacy. We'll talk a little bit about what that means and shine a light on an important case study for BNSF, a global shipping company. And finally, stacking concepts to build your praxis. Praxis is an interesting word that I came to learn about through JHU. The former director of the program back when I graduated in 2017 introduced me to it. And it's essentially about taking theory and putting it into practice. And I think it uniquely speaks to what we at JHU, those of us who came through the program or in the program, are exposed to, it is very, very interesting to go from the school aspect of, master's program into practice, because some of those first years can be really challenging because you actually find much, much more than those you're working for and with. Learning to kind of backtrack and meet people where they are is the key to making the bridge, but over time, building your practice on theory is where the real success comes in. So it's very exciting. Okay, with all that said, Natalie, you can move to the next slide. Today's path to success is systems thinking. Systems thinking is something I learned a lot about in my expertise of sustainability. I did not know anything about it, to be honest, before that. Let me just speak for a minute about sustainability. It is going to show up in this presentation a fair amount, but this is not about the environment. This is not a presentation strictly about corporate sustainability. That is an entire discipline. It's fascinating, but it's changing a lot, and it's kind of niche in a lot of ways. What is applicable to everyone, regardless of whether you ever touch sustainability as a topic in your career, although I believe many, many of us will in various ways. The principle behind it, though, is about interconnectedness, and systems thinking takes a holistic approach to problem solving, looking at the whole as greater than the sum of the parts. In my experience with JHU, and even any career paths before I studied communication concepts, we learn things in this world of hyper specialization in a silo. Many of us are stuck in a silo where we're gaining knowledge and getting more and more expertise within that particular discipline, that vertical, what have you. What this leads to, though, is a lot of experts who don't know how to work together, who don't know how to collaborate, and who don't know how to see each other's roles for what they can do. So systems thinking enables us to start seeing ourselves as part of the greater whole. And when we see that, we see points of leverage where we can make the difference in certain areas. It's going to affect how we design communication strategies, how we design communication plans, and so forth. We can move to the next slide, Natalie. What I find fascinating about that quote is actually it was created by Leonardo da Vinci. It's the way he saw things. So systems thinking is kind of a buzzword of today, and it's very cutting edge. It shows up in a lot of areas, but really the principle has been around, for hundreds and hundreds of years, probably well before that as well. But what I like about this example, this image, is it kind of gives us the secret to the success of one of the greatest artists. He, of course, was the original Renaissance man, a polymath. But we can see visually how Da Vinci's application of this principle called the divine proportion, or the golden mean, is what takes mere art and elevates it to something extraordinary. And art is, on its own, it can be beautiful, it can be meaningful, but it's very subjective. When you start putting strategy behind it, you can create a result that is appreciated by many more people. And the kind of parallel with communication is that, you can create more impact when you have a strategy behind something beautiful that you're creating. In communication, we can, use any number of strategies for certain things, but some of them are more subjective or more art. Storytelling, for example, that can be considered a form of art. But in storytelling for impact, when paired with strategy, makes it, have the potential to actually create ROI, change the results, change policy. So I want us all to just go forward with the operating principle of that everything is connected, and that goes for the skill sets that we're learning and growing, and then the way we see ourselves in the organizations that we work in. We can move to the next slide. The principle today of interconnectedness is even more important because it's probably been very evident since COVID, really. Before that, some of us knew that everything's connected, that back to sustainability. But, in many ways, again, our work has always been quite siloed, but now we're finding that really just about everybody understands the fact that one thing that is a crisis in one area is going to affect another. I'm just going to highlight a few to point out how it's affected my own career path, because I hope that this gives you an understanding of the many pivots that you may have to take, but then the opportunities that open up. So, for example, we have, the society that we're living in facing just unprecedented challenges. I'm reading constantly. I mean, pick something on the list. Of course, automation. It's pretty disturbing. I've got 2 kids in college myself, and understanding that suddenly what has been predicted since 2015 or ahead. I remember in 2015 watching C-SPAN, the author of The Rise of the Robots talking about around 2030, we would see massive displacement in automation. Yes, there are many new jobs coming online, but now you can't go really a day without reading about the loss of opportunities for certain disciplines. It is quite a shock, including computer science, Ivy League educations, so forth. So that's a major aspect of disruption that we're all dealing with every day. Climate change is another one. Climate change is why I chose the field of sustainability in 2005. Now, at that time, I will say it was a revelation to learn that human-induced climate change was going to be, a pretty crisis level event by the late 2020s and beyond. And back in 2005, living in Dallas, Texas, I did not know what I was going to do with that information, but it did shape how I chose to plan my future career. And I will say, as an example of what we can all do looking ahead, you look at these trends and you start to think, how can that affect things 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Well, guiding my career in the direction of sustainability did open up a number of opportunities when I early on chose to look at that crisis as a potential opportunity. But at the end of the day, though, it's also creating so much disruption that it's hard to know exactly how that will pay off for any of us. So it's not meant to say these are things that we want to take advantage of in a positive way. There are more things to navigate. Then comes along 2025, and we have the cost of living crisis as a priority that was not even the case 4 or 5 years ago. Now you have huge swaths of people not even being able to manage the cost of utilities and their bills. It's quite disturbing. Well, on top of that, once you factor in something like that, then you start to realize why, even though climate change is escalating, you have many corporations that aren't going to allocate budgets for that because they're trying to make their services more affordable to address the cost of living crisis, and on and on. So there's nothing much more I'll dwell on here other than just to put a pin in this and remember that when you're creating strategy for your organization or your career, you would be remiss not to give at least as much consideration to the societal change happening out there as whatever your personal goals may be. Let's move to the next slide, please, Natalie. The opportunity for all of us, though, here is that when we start to look at ourselves within this context, we can see the roles that we're playing and then the particular benefits that we bring to our organizations. Specifically, I see communicators as advocates, facilitators, translators, strategists, tacticians, and guides. This would be the case without the polycrisis. But with the polycrisis, that is this interconnected web of all of these huge challenges that the world is facing, guides have never been more important. Specifically, guides through the field of communication and how these different components can together create the roadmap that your organizations need to manage this crisis and be prepared. So preparation being really the driving force behind the learning that we're all doing here and the theory. Those things that we're learning through the research-based approach of JHU is where ultimately you become the guide that a complex organization needs to navigate the future and avoid too much risk. Next slide, please. The name of the game that we're after is communication for transformation. So organizations today, they're under increasing pressure to continuously adapt to change. Not only changing economies and technologies, but but also changing societal expectations. So the changing societal expectations is what's made the field of corporate sustainability, back to my initial expertise with communication. That is really where that field came to, grow up, starting in the 1990s, or actually late 80s, when climate change became known as a public problem. It's been a recognized problem by science since the 1850s, but it took until the 1980s for it to even really pop up on the public radar, with being addressed to Congress. And then climate science has dealt with much pushback since then. It continues to be an issue, but corporate stepped in the early to mid 1990s, recognizing a need to have a strategy to manage all of this change in societal expectation. Specifically, some of the big programs that we'll mention later in the presentation came about with the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and the recognition that even as a just polluting, required business to take a proactive approach to its impacts for environment and society. So the frameworks that we'll speak to later in the presentation are good examples of the opportunities that communicators have to harness new skills so that they can be effective communicators to guide organizations through these new and changing societal expectations for the private sector, but really across sectors. Next slide, please. Bottom line is, today's communicators must equip organizations to go beyond selling products and services to embody purpose and service. This is the spirit of corporate diplomacy. Essentially, it's about your role in the world being more than commercial. That is speaking for the private sector, but there's really a role for everyone, and those who work for NGOs, those who work for educational organizations, associations, so many different players in the spectrum of society, and all of them work together. So corporate diplomacy very much depends on collaboration across sectors, which is deeply exciting. And I think something here that I would call out specifically is that JHU students and grads are more able to do than most, because out in practice, I've experienced over and over and over a quite shocking lack of ability to collaborate across sectors or even understand what's possible there. You simply cannot devise good strategy for corporate diplomacy or strategic communication for any organization without knowing how to do that. So I think everybody here has a natural edge already, and I just want you to know that. Okay, next slide, please. Now we'll talk about the impact lens, which is how you go about being part of the transformation. It requires a certain way of looking at problems and to devise solutions. Next slide. Back to what I said initially, how you see your role in the world determines your impact in it. And again, going back to our challenges and the crises that I mentioned, not to be such a buzzkill, but I want to just call out something really that I understand. Let's just go back to even the cost of living crisis. I mean, that affects virtually everybody today. So there is a tendency for all of us to want to conform to the job description. If you're job seeking right now, trying to stay in a job or trying to get a job, the job description, being able to adhere to that means you might emerge out of like hundreds or thousands of people competing for a certain role. And it is important that you make your point that you can do that job. But the future of your career is not on a single job description. And in fact, if you're boxed in by one single job description, you are not going to grow and you won't become the communication strategist that you can become. So I really want to invite everyone here, even if you're looking to fill one particular job description or meet certain criteria, go ahead and start seeing yourself now as that holistic problem solver. Back to systems thinking. That is what a systems thinker does. Next slide, please. The way you do that is to understand impacts. So impacts in business, they cross, a lot of areas. It's, manifold, but let's just go over 5 big buckets. You'll know a lot more than most if you just understand this slide. So financial, these could be changes in revenue, profitability, and investment returns. Back to success in a changing world, that's what we're focused on, impacts and the changes coming. We see constantly changes in revenue and profitability, even now with geopolitics affecting trade. Anywhere you look, you're going to see something that needs to be messaged or communicated to somebody about the financial impacts in business. Then you have operational changes in production efficiency, supply chain management, resource allocation, and productivity. Also huge topics today. Back to the trade issues, we have supply chain management. Any issue out there, you're going to see an organization concerned about its ability to deliver on its value proposition. And that's going to go back to the operational. So communicators who really understand all of these things and you're willing to get in there and learn about the impacts of your organization, not just your communications role, you'll be more prepared as a guide. The reputational one is the obvious one to all of us. Perceptions by customers, investors, and the public affecting brand loyalty and trust. What I found that's fascinating, though, is that if you are not talking to a communicator, or especially one who understands the nuances of our field, there's a lack of appreciation for the power of the reputation factor and reputation impacts in business. Where I found a great amount of opportunity in my sustainability career, going back to that, just to use as an example, is the ability to combine sustainability expertise with communication expertise. So the intersectionality of things is where you find some opportunities. The reputational component is an extremely strong driver in corporate sustainability. Companies would all do the right thing if, nothing else was a problem, but the pressures being what they are. If it weren't for fear about reputational repercussions, many of them would not go down that road. I'm confident. So the reputational driver, whether it's brand perception or the way that executives want to appear, or the ability to license to do business and operate in certain communities, is why the communication field has so much, frankly, investment in it now. The roles are proliferating simply because reputation is becoming that important. So understanding the nuances of how to increase value and reputation is gold in our field. Social and environmental, that's the sustainability piece I've been mentioning, influence on society and the environment, including job creation, community engagement, and sustainability. So that speaks to the triple bottom line. We have, it's not just environment, but it's environment, social, and governance. That's, or the acronym ESG. And we've heard of ESG lately being vilified out there in the media. There's a lot of misunderstanding around what that is. But whatever name you call it, whether you call it corporate social responsibility or sustainability or ESG, those factors, these impacts are not going to lessen. They're only going to increase because, again, back to the interconnectedness of these issues, rising challenges from pollution to climate change, and then even back to that pesky cost of living crisis, that speaks to the societal challenges people are facing. So there's a lot of opportunity for communicators to create big value just by understanding the social and environmental aspects. And finally, stakeholder effects on employees, customers, suppliers, investors, and community. These are more of your day-to-day things that they're kind of business and society collides where you have stakeholder impacts. It's the ability to understand the impact on audiences that may or may not be direct users of your products. With that said, we can move to the next slide. We have some examples for you. Communicating for impact in general, it definitely calls for more than a press release. So you're going to learn many things in your career at Hopkins, or if you're a viewer who's attending and from industry and you're not a student, it's still something to be aware of, is that the field of communication is vast and has a number of different components within it. What I did to get to this spectrum, it was simply a big brainstorm session on what are the different ways communicators enable impact. And interestingly, I came up with probably 3 times this many words, and it was just a task just to try to, distill it down to 7 different things, just because we don't have enough hours in the day to talk about the rest. But when I organized them alphabetically, I saw an interesting process emerge, or the spectrum that goes from belief building to truth revealing. And it's just one example of how it can be really helpful while you're wading through all of these different concepts that we're learning to take a fresh look and see what emerges. Back to systems thinking, the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. Each one of these parts, and it has a little case study behind it, and we'll get into that right after this slide. Each one of them on their own is important. Let's take belief building. But it's the way they stack together and build on each other that creates the impact. So at the top, you've got belief building. When companies do that right, as we'll talk about in the next slide, they get all the way to the bottom of this and the point where truth revealing, they're a stronger voice to be part of the change in society because they've done the internal work first. So this integrated approach to taking strategies to build belief from the inside out, that's a big takeaway to how to get to a place where you can do corporate diplomacy in a way that's believable and true, and not just greenwashing or just putting your own agenda out there, but being part of moving the needle of society, which is what we want all of our organizations to be. Next slide, please. So we'll just hit on each one of these, one slide per example. I'm really just going to graze over some of the different components or concepts in communication, and we can kind of tie it up at the end. But I think when I talk to each of them, some of you will probably think that's me, or I do that, or I want to do that. So this will give you a broad-based idea of where you are contributing to the overall success of your organization when you do even one of these things. This is a screenshot, for example, of my company, the company I work for now, called TerREPOWER. My sustainability career, as I've mentioned, started in 2005. I created a practice called EarthPeople Media, which still serves a few clients today. But the major opportunity came after graduating from JHU, where I was able to work more with multinationals, go into big agencies, and eventually get to lead communications inside a large global organization. And that's why this particular company is deeply exciting to me, as well as, the belief that we're building internally for the work that we do in sustainable manufacturing. But this belief is already very much externalized because the company has been very successful for over 35 years in automotive. But the whole key to its success is this example of sustainable manufacturing as a process. And we use many different communications methods to build belief around this process that we have pioneered at this company. One example is the Chief Sustainability Officer, who you see pictured there. That's Mark Nugent. He is in a video, again, a form of communication, sharing a thought about his insights into the process. Then we have, just again on the slide as a few examples of communication, messaging that the company has created for corporate messaging through our owned channels, paid, earned, share, on peso, as we've oftentimes learned. All of these channels contribute to belief building. Internally, internal comms is a part of our work around sustainable manufacturing and how that process makes a difference within our organization, and then external communications. So without going much further into detail, because we have other examples, I just want to point out that anytime you think about communication, I invite you to do it less about the thing, the what of it, but more about the purpose, communication for belief building. Next slide. Then we have communication for educating, also very important. Something that I learned recently, not learned recently, but saw recently as something I've learned for a long, long time, is great examples of the language of advertising and its role in education. This happened in DFW Airport last week. I was headed to a conference, a clean technology conference, fascinating event. And what kind of emerged when I saw this huge sign in DFW Airport was how clever it was for the airport to use its space, its own wall space, this signage, to create interest using the language of advertising. Our airport sustainability efforts are out of sight. And the fine print on there talks about this particular type of glass that is used in the airport and the value that brings to the people. And the image is beautiful, and it makes you realize that these sustainability upgrades in the airport, which has a reputation as the world's first carbon neutral airport. It's very exciting. These features aren't just good for the world, but they're good for you as well. So when we're using the language of advertising to educate, we're recognizing that we live in a consumer culture. People are moving fast. They want to know what's in it for me. So oftentimes in the world of complex communications, we get bogged down in jargon. And unfortunately, people gloss over that. And then you have situations where people don't appreciate fully something like sustainability that could actually benefit them. So that's why I thought this was a really neat example. Even on the bev napkin in the American Airlines flight, I took a picture of that too, because it was just, again, a reminder, sometimes we need to think about adopting from another field. In my field of sustainability communication, we often forget that advertising is extraordinarily successful. So learning how to talk about how things make life better for people is an important part of creating impact as a communicator in your organization for whatever you're communicating about. And then using simple things like a URL link to drive them to more information should they choose to learn more. Next slide, please. Communication for encouraging. This is one of my favorites, simply because I think I was drawn to the field because I am a natural advocate for causes I believe in. And that came through for me as an observer here in Texas. You may know, if you saw the news at all, you probably know that we just recently experienced one of the worst floods in recent history, lost more than 130 lives here in Texas. And this was a particular import to me because when I was a child, I went to Camp Mystic. So to think about those cabins, to have slept in those cabins, not understanding even at the time, or now, quite honestly, that it was a flood corridor, it just shows that a lot of very aware and engaged people can still not fully understand the risk of a situation they find themselves in or that their children may be in. And this is happening more and more and more in the world today around just about everything. This is one example of almost any risks out there that can create havoc and horrible things that organizations would never have been even prepared for. But they're also revealing opportunities for those who are prepared. The light I want to shine on this one is HEB. It's a private company in Texas, which has done phenomenal work in terms of disaster relief in its communities. To see the amount of social media support and regular media support for this organization that went in there, not only to do disaster relief, but also create, use its platform for a number of different things to provide, food to those who were serving in the communities, to provide discounts. And then actually, let's move to the next slide. And you'll see they also gave quite a good sum of money to the effort and started mobilizing others in the private sector to substantially give to this cause. It just speaks to what's possible when you choose to look at your platform as an organization as part of this, the bigger whole, as it were. So lots of companies, by the way, came in and did some great things. I saw a number of organizations get out there and give discounts, do things that could make a difference. But what's unique about HEB is they have a long-standing role, that kind of long-standing reputation for leadership. And in addition to that, they go over and above doing sustainability reporting. In Texas, as a private company, you are not required by anyone to do that. They just do it because they believe in it. So back to belief building. It's a good example of, as we go from inner to outer or internal to external, you have more of a voice that gets listened to, that translates into real brand value when the evidence is there that you're sincere and you've been doing it all along. Nobody here was an opportunist at HEB. They were here to serve. They were there because they had the spirit of service and purpose behind their business. So I find that very encouraging. And not only could they communicate to encourage, but also mobilize others to do the same. Next slide, please. So this is really the crux of communicating for impact. That's communication for reporting. Frameworks like GRI, that stands for Global Reporting Initiative, and the United Nations SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, enable communicators to report organizational impacts to global audiences in decision useful formats. So this really helps you transcend telling a nice story. Back to our discussion about you can create art or you can create something that's impactful when there's strategy behind it. We as communicators are often looked at as like the window dressing of corporate, and it's so much deeper of a function than that. Again, we serve as guides, translators. You can only really do that though when you understand what the frameworks are that translate organizational goals into something useful for society. These two are good examples. They're not the only ones out there, but they're probably some of the most widely used frameworks for corporate reporting. The good news is anybody can use them. They're available for use by anyone, but I'd highly recommend, if you plan to go deeper into the space, getting some form of specialized training. For example, I'm a GRI certified consultant, so I know the framework well enough to actually apply it in many ways across sectors and industries. One note about that, I will say, as you have this situation out there with terms being politicized, such as ESG, you will see a decline in demand for certain kinds of services, as happened to me when I got my certification. I was running a practice for an agency on sustainability. It simply wasn't viable. After things changed politically, the new administration came in, and I'll say, quite honestly, I had to adapt and decide, am I going to go forward with sustainability reporting as my focus, or should I look at other ways to apply it? And that's when the job that I'm currently in showed up in February. I applied, got it, and then I decided to focus less on reporting, although we do that internally here, and more on how can I use my broad-based knowledge of communication and all of the concepts and theory that I learned to create really solid plans and execute on those, and teach the team different ways to create more leverage with our reputation in it for good out there in the world. So I realize even now I'm adapting constantly. You may learn something at one point and think this is the thing, and then the world's going to shift again and it may not be the thing, but it's always going to be one of the building blocks, overall. Next slide. Storytelling, back to the storytelling thing. This is just one project I want to share. It was a really fun and exciting project for me. It was something that I worked on during my Hopkins career path, or sorry, the MA, the master's I was getting, but I was also an independent consultant at the time, working with my own practice, EarthPeople Media. And IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank. I had this tremendous opportunity to do this client case study booklet called Energized. And these stories came about because of my understanding of the need to bridge silos and create more collaboration within organizations to adopt sustainable solutions. Not to get too deep into the weeds on this, but the parts that are relevant to everyone here are the needs to use communication to create solutions to problems, many of the problems being a knowledge gap in some important and critical way. So you can have all the solutions in the world, but if they're not adopted, they don't move the needle. In fact, it's interesting to know that we in the world today have 15 groups of commercially viable technologies already that could help us overcome most of the problem of climate change, but they are not being organized in a way that's impactful enough to create that transformation. They're not being adopted enough. There's problems with financing. All these problems have to be solved before we can take a major leap in that problem. So this is where I'm trying to make an example of how one communications problem you solve could lead to the bigger part of the change. In the case of this booklet, the audiences were World Bank staff and clients, and it requires communication of both the bank employees and the people who are going to benefit from the loan products to come together and create a project that's going to reduce emissions and create a better community. Everybody's going to be part of it. So one of the many examples of impact storytelling. Last slide, please, on this section. Closing out the impact lens piece of this presentation, communication for truth revealing. And I'm going to close it out here on the level of like how we can be part of communicating for impact by making a few points that tie back to the value of the Hopkins degree in particular. What I went in doing before taking the course of study I did, I was a consultant well, my original consulting background was IT consulting, early days. And then I became a sustainability consultant in 2005, specifically focusing more on the need for communication and reporting. That was the aspect that I chose. And that's why I chose to pursue my Hopkins degree, so that I could get much deeper expertise in communication specifically, because I saw that as the point that could be the difference in the field of sustainability. But overall, what I came to appreciate in the degree path is the role of journalism as the fourth estate and in democracy. So basically, if you have a bunch of independent players pursuing their own interests as advocates, that's one thing. But what's key to know and remember about journalism is that's not about your agenda. That is about the public good. So only in appreciating how we as advocates can contribute to the overall role that journalism plays in the public good can we be part of the truth revealing piece. And some examples going back to the Texas flood of how journalism, contributed to this, many examples that showed in the national and local news headlines, investigative journalism, people, really peering under the problem to figure out who was to blame or what should be changed going forward. Then you even have opinion journalism, which is something many of us will help our clients with at some point. One of the flood victims' parents in the bottom in the Houston Chronicle talked about the role that the policy of the camp played in having these girls stay in their cabins. And again, nobody was, no one meant to do this. No one meant to harm anybody. It's just, let's understand, let's reveal the truth of how to fix these catastrophic, crises going forward. And that's where you as a communicator can be part of the transformation that's happening in the culture when this process, plays itself all the way through. Okay, next slide, please. To tie it all up in one case study, and that's virtually impossible to do because there's so many out there, I've just got one I pulled off the shelf from the book I'm working on. And here in Dallas, I have the pleasure of getting to know a lot of executives in different areas, but one in particular who is over sustainability for a large shipping company, BNSF. There is a case study we're working on for the book that I'm working on. And that is something I'll just briefly touch on to show you where these things kind of tie together for one organization. Next slide, please. This is a large freight company. Many of us have seen the BNSF trains go across the country. And actually, let's back up to the slide with the green grid on it, please. One example of how you can have a very complex industry or organization that has its own, let's say, societal goals. In this case, they do use the framework, very common sustainability frameworks. And there's like a 4-quadrant model that they use: sustainable development in communities, sustainable operations, advanced energy innovation, and finally, sustainable customer solutions. Not getting into any technical detail around what they do, but it's all publicly available. You can read about it. It's a very interesting company that's doing extraordinary work in sustainable development. Rather, I'm going to talk about, let's just highlight the communications aspects that help enable this work. They include coalition building, community impact, CSR strategy, media outreach, stakeholder relations, sustainability reporting, and thought leadership. No one of us does all of these things. Of course, you're working on a team in anything this big, but when you start to understand your role as part of the bigger whole, and you understand the objective that the organization you're representing has, you can start to see the different areas where you can make a difference. For example, CSR strategy. I mean, the storytelling that goes into those reports that can be used on social media to galvanize interest in a cause, that can be used on an internal blog. It can be used through executive thought leadership. So not just the company channels, but the individuals. It can be used out there in speaking to local governments or NGOs, nonprofits. So all of these things have different audiences that they can be reaching, different channels you're deploying them through. That's kind of the bigger picture of this. And when you take an awareness of all of these pieces and then start to design a comms plan around how to address the different points in service to the whole, that is the organizational goals, that's where you become that really effective guide. Next slide. This is more just as told in pictures, to the point I just said. One example, this company is doing very innovative work and changing the way they approach shipping in the United States to reduce smog in certain communities. This is in LA. This is a picture of one of their inland ports that they're building in a nearby community to divert massive amounts of carbon dioxide that were, previously in the LA region. They can now transform that problem into a solution for sustainable development by changing their routes, which is a huge undertaking that requires many levels of communication. You need communication to bridge the silos across the departments to create the collaborative approach. You need communication to really mass communication to reach stakeholders in many of these smaller communities so that you can convey the information in a way that is non-threatening so that they can appreciate what the benefits are to those communities that are going to flow to them by being part of the change and participating in this transformation. You need communication to help the executives kind of make this all very understandable because it can get very complex and on down the line. So when we're talking about the bigger world of corporate diplomacy, I mean, it's a fancy way of basically looking at your role in the world and deciding, are you going to be an agent of, on the benefit of the whole of society or just a purveyor of products and services? The companies that have the license to make the changes that are required to have the impact, they're the ones that do that belief building from the early on, that look at their role as part of the greater whole and engage their communicators, bring them to the table, or at least give them, create more investment in the function. And in any company you're in right now, you may never be working for a global organization, but many of you will or are. But even at a smaller level, you can take, a page from this example just by looking at the whole and creating plans that address these things so that others start to see how these unique channels can create part of the overall reputation and finally brand value of that organization. Let's go to the slide. We have just two more. With all of that, I've got just a takeaway for us as individuals, building your own practice. So from planning to internal comms to crisis comms to social media, this field includes a vast spectrum of concepts. Again, you can get caught up in the job description about what you're doing now, or you can think about all of them together. I still think it's just a much more fun and exciting career when you just choose what you're going to focus on and make it about your expertise. But you may master these favorites, and at the same time, they may not be useful in the given time frame that you're working. So it's just a building block. Look at these things as building blocks to your careers rather than the only thing that you do. Overall, your strategy is going to require that you choose the right concepts to fit the organizational goals, to reach the target audiences and maximize the budget. But simply by introducing some of these concepts to people who did not previously understand them or appreciate them, you're bringing new possibilities to the table and really expanding the importance of your role and potentially their overall impact. So it's very exciting. The more of these that you learn in your classes and you choose to apply, or even just researching into the future well after you graduate, it's just more, arrows in the quiver, as it were. Last slide. Your path is made by walking. It's kind of a cliche, but it certainly was in my experience. I mean, you're going to guide organizations through the peaks and valleys of a changing world. And you can only do that when you know all the concepts. I invite you to get to know the territory, and your expertise as a guide will be invaluable. I've found that in walking the path between sustainability and communication for many years, just those two things, along the way, I got to know so much of that terrain that it's now serving, a global organization that I work in, as well as, a lot of boards that I sit on, and the places where you can make the impact may not even be in the job function that you serve. It just may be out there in the world. But I just cannot say enough about how critical this particular program has been to my personal success. And I'm just thrilled to have gotten to share all of this with you. Last slide is my email. If anyone wants to get in touch, I'm always here to talk, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. Great slides. We can go ahead and open up for questions to anyone that has any. And you can put them in the chat box. How much, I'll wait for people to ask questions, but how much AI are you using in your current role?
A lot. We're not encouraged to rely on AI in any company I've ever been in. In fact, most companies don't want that, but we all recognize it's a tool, and to not use it at some point becomes not doing your job. I've seen it being integrated into all of the tools that we use, like PR, Newswire, when I'm setting up a press release or using Grammarly. But mostly, I mean that the Gemini reports or GPT reports are opening up a lot of thinking. And so for me, I'm using it more in brainstorming than anything.
Yeah. All right, we have a question here. How do you recommend balancing your role as a communicator for an organization where the content may not match the reality or outcome for the greater good?
That's such an important question because, again, let's face it, we all work in a system where it's sometimes a organization is more serving the bottom line than the triple bottom line. Might just be having to, in fact, create more pollution than it would care to admit. And I don't want to pretend that it's easy always to have this agenda about, making a difference in your communication career. In fact, I've experienced sometimes in my communication career where it ended up looking like noise and made me even odd or somewhat out of touch with what they were trying to pursue. So if you're in a situation where you find that it's just not relevant or appreciated, I would try to think about what are the organizational goals and how can you just use everything you've learned to make them stronger and better at what they do anyway, because the more success that you have in your job, the more of a voice you do have for when an opening appears. And if you can find ways to demonstrate risk mitigation as the reason for doing something good, that's actually where the win-win happens, because sometimes companies need to mitigate risk and they'll allocate resources to that, way more than they ever would anything that just seemed kind of altruistic or good just to do good. So learning to cast what you're doing as risk mitigation, because it is a way you can make more of an impact in a conventional situation.
Great, thank you. All right, we have 2 more questions. Are there any resources you would recommend for an early to mid-career professional looking to deepen their strategic communication skills and knowledge?
Well, this is a great example right here. I mean, I think I've come back to Hopkins a few times looking for guidance. I assume that's always an open door. It certainly was for me when I would call and just want to talk to somebody who is an expert in something. I think the key is leveraging what's available to you. PRSA is also helpful. The Public Relations Society of America, I think. Sorry. They've been wonderful. Their chapters are very much peer-to-peer support. So getting the support that you need from the associations out there, the university, not letting go of those groups, but then in fact, using more social media to join organizations or groups. And there's no shortage of knowledge out there or people who want to share it. It's just about proactively building your community. And then finally, choosing, if you have subject matter expertise like I did with sustainability, doing the exact same thing with your subject matter expertise, and then accepting the fact that you might be that person walking that path back and forth, carving out that niche of expertise that maybe only you can really bring to a situation. But just don't forget all the help out there.
Yeah, I concur. And then Jan said, I really like the idea you shared that everything is connected, but when applying it to real life, it can sometimes feel overwhelming, since tasks or skills at work are always linked together. Do you have any good methods for identifying what should be the priority, or any advice on how to handle these kinds of interconnected, complex tasks?
I mean, such a good question. I've mostly learned through failure, quite honestly, in my career. So where I failed was when I was more caught up in the big picture, because that's just my wiring. I'm all about what's the big thing that I want to create. But the day-to-day is so important. Just getting the immediate job done is critical, especially in any company working on any team, because if you don't get the immediate needs met, the rest of the team can't move forward to fulfill the deliverable that is required just to move to the next day. So whatever you can do to get productivity up, that's learning the systems available to you and your team so that there's not just a loss of time in getting the actual job done. I mean, it seems obvious to say, but there's a lot of need, just increased productivity in the workplace, just to handle the demands of the job itself. Sometimes you just have to get okay with working on weekends, or use your weekend time not to do the core job, but to do the extra pieces that will eventually lead to something much greater, to allow more complexity into your career. It is a staggering amount of complexity. I don't want to sit here and sugarcoat that. I think it can be overwhelming. It can be absolutely overwhelming. So know that you aren't going to do it all by yourself. Pick your piece of the puzzle. Just get really good at doing your piece, your share, and then seek ways to have a bigger impact, but from the kind of like foundational level of excellence that you can achieve. From there, more things will open up in the future. Just accept that this is a long-term, it's a long-term play. It's definitely not short-term that we're creating impact.
Marathon, not a sprint.
That's right. That's what I was looking for.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. I know we're wrapping up on time here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Anna, thank you so much for providing your expertise and fantastic presentation. And I can't wait to read your book when it does come out.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Really appreciate it. And good luck, everyone.